All right, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for being here. My name's Scott Newbold. I'm a member of the biology faculty here at the college. I know some of you from classes, so glad you showed up. So the lecture series has been going on for quite a long time, and one of the things we're trying to do is bring scientists that are local in to share some of their work or regional, and we get support from the Sheridan College Foundation and also from the Life Science Department to help bring folks here from a little further away at times. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I just wanted to point out the schedule's here for the other 3 lectures that are coming up later in the semester, March 12th, April 9th, April 30th, and there's a variety of different topics. So take a look at that if you're interested on your way out. So it's my pleasure to introduce Scott Robinson tonight. He's the director at Guidehouse, which we'll hear some more about, I'm sure, and owner of Sigma 2 Systems, where Scott provides data science and modeling expertise to challenges in the energy industry. He also lives down the road in Story, so he's a local nearby. Scott earned his master's degrees in energy and earth resources from the Jackson School of Geoscience and from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, both at the University of Texas at Austin, where he also collaborated with the Texas Advanced Computing Center to simulate the customer purchase behavior of energy technologies in a geographic agent-based model. I'm excited to hear more of this. So at Guidehouse, Scott leads teams of data scientists and engineers to conduct complex simulations of the electric transmission and distribution grid and the social and economic systems that influence the future of the electric system. Scott's worked with a range of large electric utilities, private companies, and government clients to better understand potential challenges, from hardening the grid to withstand extreme weather events, to forecasting the penetration of electric vehicles, batteries, and heat pumps in customer populations. So you can see tonight's title is Forecasting the Future, How Technology is Changing the Electric Grid. Thanks a lot for being here, Scott.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, so welcome, guys. If you got through that intro, that's a little technical for sure. The grid is complex, evolving giant machine that we're kind of like intertwined with. To make it a bit easier, you can ask questions at any time, and I'm going to pause every section and just stare at you blankly until you ask me questions.
Okay.
So I expect a little bit of interaction. Hopefully we can make fun. Yeah, so, clicker's not working. I'll just manually advance. Maybe.
Might be for that first one once we start.
Yeah. Okay, let's try it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, just needed to warm up. Much like me. So instead of looking at this giant wall of text, I was leaving these breadcrumbs, some fascinating after-class reading, some work that I've done in the past, as well as some public testimonies that I've been meticulously cross-examined by lawyers against, which is mostly what I spend my free time doing when I'm not driving all-electric battery-operated excavators, which is awesome. I work for big power companies. So MDU is the company in Sheridan. We work for that, my employer, Guidehouse, and my own company, Sigma 2. We work for some of the biggest power companies across the country and help them figure out how to solve all their challenges, like how to deliver power safely, reliably, and in the ever-changing climate that we are now, individual consumers can do things like purchase electric vehicles, install solar PV or heat pump, something like that, and change their load on a daily basis. Okay, so that's a bit about me. Now a bit about the grid. So this, believe it or not, is as simple a diagram as I could make. I was sitting there yesterday trying to okay, what's the simplest way I can explain like what the power grid is doing and how it's influenced. So I came up with this. Just basically, the grid itself is defined by like 3 components, basically, right? Generation, actual power plant, right? Generating power. It's usually a turbine, or typically boiling water, spinning a turbine, and using that to generate electricity through magnetism. Transmission, which is how you get the generation down the road, right? If you've ever driven under a giant transmission tower, something like that. It's, you know, the big ones, giant steel poles. That's the transmission network. It brings big power down to little power. If you've ever, you know, gone down to Bighorn to go like stop the merch or something like that, Bighorn Merc, right before you turn the pizza shop, there's that little power station, a bunch of relays and breakers and stuff like that. That's a substation. Basically switches from transmission to distribution. Distribution is how you get power from the substation to your house. So those are three components, and they all interact in a very linear, nice way, more or less, hand wavy, right? Everything tonight is going to be like kind of true, kind of simple, okay? And then there's people that work in management of the grid to either like ramp up a generator if it's not at full capacity. Imagine a guy with a big lever, right? Okay, more power, right? To some extent, you can do that. And build new power plants. Pretty much the only two levers they have, except for this one, price. 3 levers you have to operate this giant machine. More or less. Again, you know, we're hand wavy here, but this is the basic understanding. And then you're exposed to all the stuff on this side. So the grid's affected by basically these 3 boxes. Again, very simplistic. The weather. When it's hot, people turn on air conditioners. When it's cold, people turn on their electric furnaces or heat pumps. And the grid has to produce more power in order to serve that load. Customers and technologies, those are the jerks that are changing stuff in their houses all the time and their businesses and making our lives difficult if they're in grid management, right? And then policy and markets. These are policymakers maybe doing some incentives or, you know, rules that grid operators have to follow. And then there's the market itself, which determines price of things like natural gas and coal and, you know, rare earth materials we use to make wind turbines, polycrystalline solar and all that kind of stuff. Okay, right. So here's how they interact, more or less. Imagine the grid, or imagine anybody ride bikes, bike riders professionally or not. Yeah. So load, the stuff generated by these guys, when you turn on a light, right, run a computer, all that kind of stuff, put it together, basically making a road. And us as the grid operators are the guy on the bicycle. And when load goes up, you have to pedal harder. And when load goes down, you have to back off or you end up going too fast. Right? So you have to follow that load in real time as it's changing. And the grid is kind of special because it's not electricity, that is a special thing because I'm going to throw batteries out for just a second. You can't really store it, right? So you can only generate it and transmit it, move it from one pool to another. You can't store it in a big underground tank. There's no like fuel tank or here's your electricity. I'm going to dump it in the ground. So you have to meet this stuff in real time, which means when you turn on your lights, something in the grid actually has to change, right? Which is really cool. It's a huge dynamic machine. The other thing, again, about like weather, right? So that creates demand, but then an interesting feedback loop here on generation. When we generate power from some sources that burn fossil fuels, they release CO2 into the atmosphere and can very slowly change the climate itself. There's one feedback loop. Weather and climate creates resource availability on the wind and solar side and very, very slowly via fossil fuels, right? All that stuff that we're burning is actually just organic matter. It's been sequestered. And let's see, what am I missing? On the price side, this is kind of interesting because this takes a lot of time, and so does this one, building new power plants. So you can set price. You go through a rate case. Anybody read the news about the rate case that Rocky Mountain Power went through? It actually made the headlines. I was like, yes, electricity's in the news. Very rare. Wyoming fought it, and the PUC threw it out. And now Rocky Mountain Power, via Pacific Core, the parent company, is now suing the state of Wyoming. Very exciting stuff. But that takes a long time to change prices. It also takes a really long time to build a new power plant. So the only quick lever they have at all is this like ramping, shutting things on or off. Now, the point that I'm trying to get across is it's kind of hard to be in this little blue box at the top. Okay, so hopefully you kind of understand a bit about the grid now. What I'm going to be talking about tonight, it's kind of three buckets. What are the things that are changing on the customer side? I was kind of saying facetiously, you know, customers are jerks these days. They are buying things that make grid operators' lives more difficult. Electric vehicles, heat pumps, solar PV batteries, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to talk about each one of those a little bit, give you some brief understanding. And then what I do most of the time, I'll say 70% of my work is forecasting. So that's trying to predict the future with a mathematical model, right? Like, you know, a straight line is a mathematical model. You can use it to predict the future via the slope and the intercept, right? I like my models to be a little more complicated than that, but not too much more, because then people don't understand them and regulators ask me too many questions. And rate cases and stuff like that don't go through because they're too complicated. And then I'm going to talk about the Wyoming grid in particular, because it's been static for a long time and not very interesting. And now all of a sudden it's starting to become interesting. Okay. All right. Questions? This is the part where I'm just going to sit here, so I can drink my lemon tea appreciatively.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said that energy can't be stored, but you were throwing out batteries. So why can't it be stored on a like batteries, but on a larger scale?
Yeah. So it can. Yeah, I was throwing it out for simplicity, because when you're trying to understand it, the thing about batteries is they're still expensive. They're getting cheaper and cheaper, but big batteries, the kind that can operate at utility scale, at like a megawatt, gigawatt scale, like a power plant, they're very expensive. And so it's not practical yet. Grid operators are trying. There's a lot of cool pilot projects. They're actually finally just kind of entering the waters of like utility scale batteries in a lot of the country. Don't have any in Wyoming, but in some parts of the world there are. Some of the most exciting ones are actually in Hawaii, where the price of power is the highest in the country. So therefore it's economic, right? Because they're replacing like diesel generators. A battery looks pretty good compared to a diesel generator. It doesn't look good compared to a wind turbine or a gas generator. Okay, good question. Anything else?
So not to put you on the spot too much, but
That's what I'm here for.
hey, do you get paid by are your interactions on the regulator side, on the power company side?
All the above.
Both.
I've worked for regulators and PUCs. I've worked for utility companies. I worked for original equipment manufacturers like Tesla or Audi or Bosch or anybody like that. We're consultants, so we're guns for hire. If you've got a hard problem and it involves electrons, you can hire us. Yeah. And I've actually been on different sides of the same rate case at some point, where you're like, sometimes you're laying the case out for why solar PV makes sense. Sometimes you're laying the case out for why it doesn't. So
When an offer comes, just out of curiosity, when an offer comes in, is there one aspect of it that you're like, all right, I really like that, or oh man, not again?
yeah, definitely. Mostly just because some things are getting kind of boring for me now. It's like, if I do one more energy efficiency potential study, I will collapse. Because I've been doing them since 2013 or so. But there's no issues that I think are just like other than them not being interesting, or that I would avoid necessarily.
Which are most interesting for you at this point?
I think if right now, a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about now, so the interaction between customers and the grid, also the rapid change, and I have one little slide about it with data centers being the biggest thing that's going to happen to the electric grid since sliced bread, because the loads are absolutely enormous and they're happening faster than we can build them. So I'm not going to talk about that a ton. I've got one little slide on it, but if you want to chat about it, bug me afterwards. Anything else?
The storing electricity via capacitance is the same answer as the battery thing, just too expensive or not practical.
Expensive, not practical. Yeah. You can. You can even store. I mean, there's lots of ways to store electricity, right? One of the best ones is you store it via gravity, inertia. You pump it upstream, right? And we do that a lot in hydro plants. When power is super, super cheap, run giant pumps, pump it back into the reservoir. When energy is expensive, open up the gates, let it come back down. So there are lots of ways to store energy, right? But it's hard to store electricity because there what you're doing is you're converting from, electricity to mass and then back to electricity again, right? But I knew I'd get in trouble for all the caveats. I've got a lot of asterisks in my slides because I'm trying to keep things simple, but yeah. Anything else? Okay. Heat pumps. This cartoonist is my favorite. I use a lot of his stuff in this talk. Nothing says peak summer like a cookout during rolling blackouts. They're cooking with charcoal. They're probably in Texas. They're not in Wyoming. Because our grid peaks in the winter. But yeah, blackouts, a good time to cook out. Becoming worse because heat pumps, bottom line, guys, heat pumps add a lot of peak demand. So they make it really hard to serve. When you're in a grid planner, you have to serve the very, very peak. So you have to build enough generation to serve the peak, even if it's only a single hour of the whole year. And the rest of the time you're, 10x lower. You have to build enough capacity to serve that single hour, right? Because you're regulatorily obligated to serve it. This is me taking out my heat pump a few years ago. It's up on a 6-foot pad and the thing is about 6 feet and it was under the snow and I had to dig it out 2 years ago. So, but they work. The thing was still operating. -20 and it was still running. Technology's great. I'm not going to go through this in detail. Don't worry. But a heat pump is just a heat exchanger. It's really cool. Just like an air conditioner. Takes refrigerant and a compressor, converts, makes cold if you're running heat, right? It makes the air around the outdoor unit really, really cold. Even if it's like -20, it'll be -30 where your heat pump is. It brings warm air into the house via the heat exchanger. It's a miracle. This is the big deal, right? 2 to 5 kW, so it basically doubles the peak power of an individual house. So somebody installs a heat pump and it'll just about double their peak load. So every time that happens, the utilities have to be like, oh, this is worth paying attention to. And it tends to shift peaks to the winter. Historically, overall, the US, we tend to kind of have a summer peak for air conditioning load because we have a lot of air conditioners in the US. Heat pumps are changing that and they're shifting that peak into the winter. And really what they're making is that peak to be bimodal, which is hard for the utilities to do as well, which is more expensive. Could have your payback typically for heat pumps, even in a place like Wyoming, which is another reason why the quote problem with these from a utility planner's perspective is that they're increasing load pretty rapidly. People are adopting them because they're economic, right? So they're taking energy that was being sourced from, natural gas or wood biomass or, a boiler, usually natural gas or propane. They're converting to electricity, so all that load has to be electric. These are just some fascinating histograms that show the cost, the bill savings, incremental cost, and total net present value if you're an economics person of heat pumps. Now, a ton of different houses in Wyoming, actually, simulated. And everybody over here in the blue is making money. And this curve has just been shifting right over time, which means more and more households are economic. Basically, if your furnace is about to die, get a heat pump because you'll save money. Or if you're already in propane, kind of guaranteed to already save money out the gate. Right. Oh, and fascinatingly, installation rates in Wyoming, at least, are still quite low. I tried to look this up in this giant database of installations, and Wyoming sample size was too small to even be reported. So, but I don't think that'll be true next year. Questions about heat pumps? That was really quick, but I think you get the idea. They're less exciting. It just adds load to the grid a lot. And since electric since this insulation rate is so low, the building stock in Wyoming has a ton of potential to basically double the total load requirement for the state because of this. Because we're basically at zero right now. If everybody gets a heat pump, which economics dictate pretty soon they will, as soon as that, everybody's old boilers and furnaces turn over, smart money gets a new heat pump instead of a new furnace because you can save money. Then we're gonna have twice as much electric load to meet in Wyoming. Questions? Yeah,
So
Amy.
I just want to make sure I understand. You're saying that the heat pumps are increasing the peak point of our electricity consumption? And so
Yeah,
we
let me-
need to plan for more consumption if we all have heat pumps?
Yeah, right. So like, okay, danger zone, I've got a whiteboard and a marker.
Or-
So more or less in the winter, and this is time, hours a day, right? 24/0. Your electric load kind of looks like this. More or less. Peak in the morning when it's cold and you wake up and your furnace is coming on. And when you get home, because a lot of people commute and they come back and so they keep their home cooler. And this is true even if you don't have electric resistance, just because you get up and you start doing stuff, right? Maybe take a shower, water heater comes on. Maybe you turn on a bunch of lights, run the dishwasher, whatever. So if you add a heat pump, right, you end up looking like this. More or less, right? And so you end up at 2 and you were at 1. You remember that bike riding example? So you're riding a bike up this hill, it's a lot harder, right? You're at a lot more resistance here. So that's tough for the grid to follow. And you're at a bigger kind of gap down there at the bottom. So that means that the grid doesn't have to do anything there. So what do? You ramp down load. Well, that's expensive too. So it's hard.
So even with the increase of electrical rates, it's still more economical to have the heat pump versus
Yeah.
like various
Yeah.
furnaces.
Especially, so if you hold a lot of things constant, if you hold gas price constant, yes. It's not economic to throw away your working gas furnace, replace it with a new heat pump. It is economic to wait till it dies, replace it with a heat pump, then you're making money, saving money, but you get it. If you have propane, it's even cheaper over the long run, net present value style, right? Annualize the cash flows, all that fun stuff, to replace it today, and you'll be saving money on it. And that's without incentives. All the little calculation stuff without incentives. You can even get, rebates and stuff from the federal government for installing these because they have efficiency programs, electrification programs. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, kind of. I'm puzzled by it. But so before furnaces and probably still today, the electric baseboards
Yeah.
are the primary.
Most
heat
least
source.
efficient things in the world.
So I'd be spending more money on electricity with an electric baseboard than
Yeah.
I would be with an air pump.
Yeah, a ton more, almost 3 times as much because of this thing. That heat exchanger is so efficient because it works on the gradient because what an electric resistance heater is doing is it's literally running electricity through a terrible conductor. It's forcing it through. And that the resistance, it's such a terrible circuit that it heats up, right? It's such a bad circuit. It's such a bad conductor that it creates heat. And we're like, oh, good, let's huddle around it for warmth. And meanwhile, you're wasting like kilowatt after kilowatt and turning them into heat. The heat exchanger borrows basically the heat that exists outside, difference between, -20 and whatever your refrigerant is, like, -150 or so, that delta gradient, and uses that to heat your home. So it's way more efficient.
What's the average lifespan of a heat pump, out of curiosity?
These new ones, we don't even know. Like when I show you buried there, right? That's a brand new Mitsubishi Hyperheat. they can operate in like -20, -30. So I was like, that's what I want. I live in Story. We have no idea how long they'll last because they're brand new. The old ones, quote, quote, they were built in the 90s, lasted about 20 years. Ones in the 2020s, most of them haven't turned over yet, so we're not sure, maybe 25, something like that. But the worst heat pump will operate as long as the worst air conditioner. So 5 years and you should be suing the company. If it's 10 years, you can grumble about it. If it's about 15, maybe that's kind of average, right? As long, and it's just like an AC. If you have it, you pull the refrigerant out. If you have it serviced, it'll last longer. So treat it like an air conditioner, basically. Anything else on heat pumps? Okay, solar time. If you thought installation rates for heat pumps were low in Wyoming, here we go. So for start us off with anybody get this one? Yeah. Okay. A little bit different between like this kind of stuff and the giant mirrored arrays with molten salt columns you see out in the Nevada desert. A little bit. I got to visit one. Holy mackerel. That thing's intense. Very cool, but very, 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 very hot. Texas. Okay, this is kind of funny. So see these tiny blue bars? Guess what that is? That's Wyoming residential and commercial solar installations over the last 10 years. Too small to see. But here's US. Fairly linear. Maybe you could say it's a low grade exponential, right? It's there. And very kind of bumpy, false policy, right, with solar. You want to understand solar, it's policy stuff. But I did some napkin math in Wyoming. And first of all, everybody kind of understand the basics about solar PV, the photovoltaic effects, that kind of stuff. Sunlight shines on a surface, generates free electrons. Free electrons are in DC, produced, sent through an inverter, where it's at the AC power you can use in your house. Most of that's it's actually just mixed out into the grid. So even when you install solar on your house, you don't know how many electrons from the PV system you're using versus the electrons from the grid. It's all just, mixed together in a soup, but sure makes you feel nice. But the math is pretty easy. Bottom line, even in Wyoming, you end up, saving about $1,000 a year or so. Solar. So that means it pays back in 10 years, more or less. Which, if you're an investor, right, you're on Wall Street, like, oh yeah, I want something that's gonna give me my initial capital after 10 years. You'd rather have that heat pump that paid off in 2, right? Yeah, so would everybody else. This is without incentives, and the federal investment tax credit gives you 30% off and things like that. But bottom line is that we have fairly cheap power in Wyoming, and solar saves you money by producing power. So if power is cheap, solar doesn't make as much sense. You want to be in California or Hawaii or something like that, where power is twice or 3 times as expensive, and this stuff therefore can pay off in 3 years or so. It's 10. But it still does. I mean, solar lasts 30 years. This solar PV, the panels themselves, inverters last about 15. So, you're going to be sitting on 20 years of almost free energy if you do it, but you have to eat that upfront cost. Okay, that was a really quick solar, but any questions there? Yeah.
So with the solar arrays in Nevada, how do they compare to Hoover Dam?
Yeah, they're tiny. So the biggest, I have to have a slide on this later on, but so like the biggest generator in Wyoming, right, is about 2 gigawatts. Jim Bridger coal plant. The biggest solar PV station, or even the biggest concentrating solar stations, are less than 1 gigawatt. So they're smaller. They're cool. They're very cool. And they're great because like, what's the obvious thing that everybody points out about solar? Why is it like not ideal for power generation? If you try to do this load following stuff, what happens? What does solar look like? 0 to 24. Yeah, when? Like, what's it look like?
It's gonna be lower during the day when it's sunny, right?
Higher. Well, the
Oh,
production,
higher.
we're on the production
Production's
side.
higher.
Yeah.
Yeah, production.
So it goes like this.
Peak at noon.
Yeah. Oh, it misses both the peaks, right? And there's nothing going on here, nothing going on here. And then, you know, you got just add cloud and all this goes away immediately. So if you plot this over like a full year, I'm going crazy, you know, whatever, guys. I'm sorry. This is just kind of how I do presentations. If you plot this over a year, like the graph of solar PV production, it kind of looks like this. Looks like a stack of little trees. And if you plotted a coal plant or the same time horizon, it looked like this, just a nice flat Hershey's bar of power because it's on constantly. The solar is jagged. What's the answer? You said it earlier.
I did.
Yeah, you did.
Energy, yeah. Stored in energy.
You store it. You flatten that out. Right. Well, what's the problem with that? Expensive. Yeah. Electric vehicle, any other solar stuff? Okay, EVs. So I love this one too. This guy is still holding out for an EV. It's practical, affordable, and doesn't look weird. And he would not be the only one. I have a 2019 Nissan Leaf, which is the least weird looking of the Nissan Leafs. I remember the originals had these big old bug eyes in front, and tiny little hatchback. It looked like, my cat would bring voles in. I grew up in Douglas on a ranch. Cat bringing voles in all squished, and they have bug eyes, and that's kind of how they looked. Beautiful car. But this is my 2022 Ford F-150 Lightning, which is also fully electric. Looks pretty normal. So let's talk about EVs a bit. So everybody wants to know about charging, right? So here's a charging map in Wyoming. Look at that. It's just funny, right? You guys get it, right? We're in the charging desert. Charging can be either really slow or really fast. If you plug into a 120, that little outlet there, everybody's got in their houses, 120 volts, 1.1 kW or so. Plug your EV into that. It'll charge it. It's just, it's just like charging your iPhone. It's the simplest technology in the world in that sense. Like everybody gets it. It works. Problem is, like that F-150 Lightning, that's a 120 kilowatt hour battery pack, which means you have to run a 1 kilowatt current for 120 hours to fill it all the way up. Sound fun? No. So you want to fast charge it. Fastest chargers that right now they're publicly available for folks like you and me are 350 kW kilowatt, right? That's kind of nice. So you take that same 120 kilowatt hour battery. Now all of a sudden I can charge it in half an hour. Great. There's a good station in Target. I can run into Target and before the time I can get out, my truck's fully charged if I ever get it down to zero, which, I would sometimes drive my old gas truck that way, like try to coast it into the gas station. I don't drive my EV that way because it's too scary. It takes about half an hour. So that's a difference. That's a huge difference, right? Imagine a gas station where, you had like this tiny little eyedropper of a nozzle or like a giant one. It just doesn't work that way. They're all the same. So one of the things that's weird about this is like you have to teach consumers, folks like you and me, about this, that now all of a sudden there's different speeds, and literally the difference between a sloth and a cheetah is about a 350x, right? So that's the difference that we're talking about. Super, super fast or super, super slow. Rule of thumb, right? People want to know how fast it takes to charge. That's like what people ask you in Albertsons parking lot. How fast does it take to charge that thing? Half an hour. right? But most of the time, I don't do any of this public stuff because every sane person, EV owner, just plugs it into their RV outlet or their dryer outlet at home, and you can just charge it overnight, no problem. So I wake up every morning, full tank gas. Driving 250 miles is about standard these days. Okay. It's again, this is one of those things. Yeah. It's complicated. There's a huge range. There's efficiency. Some cars are aerodynamic, some are not. All that affects this. So does speed, wind, cold, all the things we have in Wyoming affect your range, just like they do in your gas vehicle. You just don't notice. And the performance is awesome. It's way better. Even my kind of extreme car nerds are like, yeah, okay, it's more fun to drive and it works better. Fine. I get it. And the economics are really appealing, especially in a state where, so what was bad for solar in Wyoming? Anybody remember? What was the problem with solar in Wyoming?
The constant.
It doesn't keep with the demand.
I heard cost is the one, because we have cheap power. So if you're basically producing power, that's bad news. If you're consuming a lot of it, like an electric vehicle, it's great news because all of a sudden, look at this. I spend about $600 a year in electricity versus $1,800 in gasoline if you're an average person. So you save half the fuel price. Driving this giant brick of a thing, right? And you can guess what the drag coefficients in that are. If you drive, like a Chevy Bolt or something like that, you're going to do way better. Okay. All right. So all this to say, it doesn't take an Einstein to figure out this math. Like if you're trying to buy a new vehicle, you're like, okay, well, how much do I spend on gasoline? Would it be nice if I could cut that in half? So people are starting to figure that out, right? Even in Wyoming, where we resist these types of things. This should go back all the way to 2015 or so, when the first commercially EVs were available, but these are pretty low numbers, right? 200, 400. This is stocks. How many vehicles on the road? Registrations from the state DOT. Almost no incremental, and all of a sudden, what's that kind of curve look like? What's the name for it? We have a nice scientific name for that kind of stuff.
Exponential.
Yeah. What happens to exponential things? They grow. So when will it stop? Well, we're not exactly sure. But that was 2023. All right, last year we have registration data for. This is 2024. That's about a 20-30% growth rate. Early data in 2025. We have 1 month so far. Looks like it's about 30% higher than 2024 January. So we month to month it. You can imagine this is the most basic, I'll show you some of the complex models here, but if you had a napkin model and you're like, I'll give you $5 to predict the future of electric vehicles in Wyoming. You're like, okay, hold on, let me get there's 2026. There's 2027, right? That's just how it works. But still, again, back to the grid planning side. How much are we right now? Less than 1%, which is really, really small. But we have a huge way to go, which is kind of really exciting because, wow, all that transformative capacity, all those batteries, right, that we need. Each one of those vehicles has a battery in it. You need to store electricity. Great way to store electricity. But what's it going to do to electric load? Potentially some scary things. Those 350 kW chargers I was talking about earlier that make it so nice when I stop at Target to charge up my car so fast. Well, this is what's behind those. Those are power cabinets and transformers, relays. Those are expensive. They're big. There are electric semis in the Pacific Northwest now, made by Daimler, great company. I got to test drive one of their battery electric Class 8 trucks, big old truck. They charge on 3 megawatt So you pick up the charging cable, you plug it in. 3 megawatts is big, guys. That's like a small town, an office building, right? A big office building. You install 20 of those in a Flying J. Okay, right? It's like downtown Manhattan in one little area in the middle of the country. And power planners have to figure out how to get that power there. So it's transforming the grid. Okay. And so again, little napkin math, I'm a big fan. We've got about, 600,000 vehicles in Wyoming. If you electrify all of them, you follow that exponential all the way, right? Which is going to happen eventually. Like again, no, I'm no Nostradamus, but like it is a fundamentally better technology and it's cheaper. So probably going to transform most of the light duty vehicles. Once that happens, well, we're going to need about 2 gigawatts more of electric power just to serve those in Tyne, Wyoming. So that's basically another Jim Bridger power plant, right? Just serving those new electric vehicles. So it's a big deal. And that, by the way, Jim Bridger right now, our biggest power station, just ships power right across the border. We don't even use it in Wyoming. So. Okay. Questions on EV stuff? Yeah.
I'm a little concerned about the materials
Batteries.
used in the construction of batteries and what they're gonna do with them. It's gonna end up like a nuclear waste problem as the batteries age out.
Yeah. So there's some good news and some bad news. The bad news is yeah, those are very cool, kind of special, hard to get materials, right? Especially rare earth elements. They're used in them. And there's no getting those back, right? It's extractive, it comes out of the ground. You don't like put it back. And if you do put it back, it can do bad things to water and all kinds of things like that. Good news is that battery refurbishing and recycling is a booming industry. I think there were, can't remember the exact number, somewhere between 100 and 500 new companies started last year. They're doing battery recycling. And Nissan, Honda, Ford, Tesla, GM, none of them are giving their batteries to these recyclers. So there's more demand for spent batteries than there is supply because they're actually super valuable. So there's a trade wars going on about like used batteries right now. So they're going to have a second, third, and probably fourth life. But then after that, eventually we're going to have to tear those things down and reuse the components or put them in a landfill somewhere. I hope it's the former. Anything else on vehicles? The question people always ask is like, going back to the climate thing, if you're concerned about climate change, what's better? In Wyoming, using an electric vehicle that we all know is using mostly coal to power it, or using an efficient vehicle. In Wyoming right now, it's the best situation you can do if you're concerned about climate change is to take your F-250 and drive a Prius instead, hybrid, very efficient hybrid. But if you switch your F-150 for an F-150, like I do, you save about half of the CO2 and all of the NOx and SOx and stuff like that on the point source emissions from your tailpipe. You outsource them to Dave Johnson to some extent, right? But those are being scrubbed because of federal air quality rules, at least. Okay, complicated question, not my area of specialty at all, but I have to answer that question a lot, so do a little research. Anything else? Cool. So forecasting, this is my bread and butter. And that's literally me watching TV in front of the couch. Get in here. The grid's stable. 200 more megawatts have come online because the wind. Oh, it's so exciting. And forecasters are really bad at our jobs. So this is solar PV forecasts each one of these lines is a forecast, starting from when the forecast was made. We're like, we think it's going to be kind of flat. And then next year comes along, but we think it's going to be kind of flat. We're like, yeah. Nobody's following this exponential, right? Because our brains like to be linear. So this, forecasters, we're all bad at our jobs, apparently, because nobody's predicting this right. Does everyone understand this graph? It's not critical. The point is, it's hard to forecast the future because we tend to estimate business as usual, right? When things in complex dynamic systems that have a lot of feedback loops tend to hate business as usual and tend to move very quickly. This is another look at that same thing. This is kind of the opposite. This is electric demand. So utilities forecasting electric demand over time. And then this is the actual. So that's our rose-colored glasses. Utilities like, demand's going to pick up next year. It's going to be huge. This is the stuff I'm talking about right now. But then historically, but note that this stops in 2014, right? Historically, it stayed flat. Can anybody guess why? Why that upward demand's never come on until about 2014 or so? It's kind of tough one. Energy efficiency stuff, right? Electric technologies have gotten more and more efficient over time. And our homes have too, especially new construction. Methods are improving. This is my, my ruler method, my finger math. Okay, regression's a little better than that. Now we have some advanced things like convolutional neural networks and stuff like that can do way better. This is a better diagram of what I was trying to whiteboard there earlier. This is what load looks like over a year. And this is way smooth, but this is what the controllers are trying to do, trying to follow this load. And what forecasters are trying to predict. This is a single year. So my typical client will be like, Scott, what's my hourly load for the next 50 years gonna look like? And so I was like, I'll produce something like this for every year, right? And then send it to him in the giant, Amazon bucket or, God forbid, a bunch of CSVs. But it's got patterns, right? It's nice. Summer, winter, that's just like I showed, right? The double hump there, single hump there for air conditioning. We've got seasonal patterns. This is for the whole US, right? You can see, okay, we got the summer peak. In Wyoming, it's the opposite. We have a winter peak. And you have the weekday weekend thing, right? So you can kind of decompose these big time series, take out the little patterns and predict each one of them together and cobble them up to create a whole. Okay. So how do we do this stuff in reality? Well, if this talk lights a fire under you and you want to decide, okay, well, I want to be a modeler, Scott. I want to be a forecaster just like you. So here's some tools. We've got time series regression, which has anybody done an econometrics class or done some regression? Very common in biology as well, right? What we're trying to do is you've got a bunch of points. You're trying to find a best fit line between them that minimizes the error of your line. If your line is way up here and your points are down there, big error. It's right in the middle, low error, right? Time series regression basically uses autoregressive methods, which basically means let's assume that the future is going to look like the past. It's the fundamental. It's a lot like that ruler. Okay, I saw what trend the line's going. Let's try to follow it. It's simple. It's computationally efficient. It's very nice. But remember all those plots that showed how bad forecasts are? What's the problem with the future? Oftentimes it doesn't look like the past. So we have to get more complex. So this is a time series example of time series regression models, right? This is the forecast. This is the actual. So we're like, okay, yeah, it's going to look we're follow the same pattern. Structural models try to say, no, instead of just trying to say what did the past look like in a single time series, I'm going to try to estimate all of the causality in the system, right? So, if you take an example from biology, you're like, okay, well, I know the reason that my hare population is oscillating is because my fox population is oscillating. And so if I can understand the causality of my hares dropping their population is the fact that my fox population is increasing, I can model that structurally, right? And I can identify the correlations between those two variables, right? Now, if you want to get one more complicated, probably the problems with these, so you're increasing your accuracy and your precision. Problem is you're increasing your computation though, right? If you want to get even more complicated, this is what I really like. It's agent-based models where you say, okay, now I want every hair in my population to have an individual identity in my computer code. And I'm going to track its health and well-being and all of its status and who its friends are and where its burrow is and all this kind of stuff, right? And all of the foxes too. So for the electric grid, we have to say, where's every customer on the grid? What equipment do they have in their homes? And what do the power companies have? What's this capacitor bank look like? What does this generator, what's its heat rate and all this kind of stuff, right? As you can imagine, it's super, super complex and it gets really, really big and computationally almost impossible. So you end up doing trade-offs and sometimes you use these and sometimes you use these depending on how much money your client has. I mean, how much compute you have to do. Well, okay. Any questions about those three arrows in your quiver? Makes sense. Clear as mud. Okay, well, let me give you a quick example. Okay, so here's a structural model. This could also be an agent-based model if you have imagine this is one agent's kind of like decision process or a single structural model, which is more computationally efficient. All right. Let's start with technology attributes. So okay, I've got a heat pump. Now I need to abstract this thing into math. Okay, it's 4 kW. It's, it got this load shape. It's got this lifetime, right? It lasts 15 years. It costs this much, et cetera. We've got to know the customer attributes about the person or the household that buys it. What's their existing power load looks like? What's their income, stuff like that. How likely are they to want this kind of thing? Market attributes, like what's the price of natural gas? What's the price of electricity? What's the price of the heat pump? Customer economics, so I do some financial modeling and I try to calculate that net present value thing. Like, okay, well, or the payback period, how is this thing making money for the customer or not? Are they going to like it? And then that kind of determines my market size. Because most of the time we like to assume that people are rational, or on average, customer populations are rational. Or if they're not, we need to find out how irrational they are. So that kind of gives us the asymptote. In other words, where are things going? Where does that exponential stop? Right. Well, it stops once it stops making money. If 40% of the population can save money, well, maybe my asymptote is around 40%, right? Ceteris paribus, holding all the factors constant. And then I need a technology adoption model, which is usually just something that tries to estimate that shape, that ramp up toward the asymptote. We like these things called vast diffusion, but you can use anything that's kind of S-shaped. And we think that that's because of awareness. People don't know if it saves money. They don't know how to buy it. They don't know if it's trustworthy. So they talk to their friends and neighbors and they do research on the internet and all that kind of stuff. And they become aware. Oh, it either saves money or doesn't. I'm in the 60% or the 40%. And then I can adopt it. And then this whole layer is where I spend actually most of my time. The grid impact stuff is, okay, what does it do once someone purchases the technology, right? And then you have all this utility data, asset management system, their GIS, their customer information system, and informs like, okay, well, what's it do? Right. So we have to do a big power flow model to figure out what that individual heat pump did to the grid and what we need to build in the next 50 years to support it. And all these little yellow boxes are kind of like the tools of the trade. So if you're looking through the course catalog, and you want to be like, okay, well, Scott, you told me I need to do these things to become a forecaster. Well, better pick up some GIS, some regression from the biology or economics department. I better pick up some vast diffusion from, God knows where. Some stock turnover and differential equations from the math department. I better discrete choice modeling back to economics department. Right, so you got to be kind of eclectic and curious and multidisciplinary. Okay. Any questions on forecasting? That was like my treat for the talk. The rest of it was for you guys. That was for me. Any questions there? Yeah, it's like no forecasters here. No thanks. I don't blame you. There, Wyoming's power grid. So this is, I think, pretty fascinating. Again, I'm leading with a comic, build a nice giant wind farm, but we don't get to use any of it because it's all going to the metaverse. This is another cool one. This is the site of the Dave Johnson coal mine in my home county. Beautiful reclamation job on old coal mine, and now there's wind power generation right on top of it, which eventually they'll have to reclaim again. Cycle goes on. Okay. Faceless corporations that are charging you money every month for power. These are the 5 big ones. So there's 5 big investor-owned utilities, IOUs. There are 15 municipal retail energy providers in Wyoming, and there's 23 co-ops. If you're a MDU customer, you fall into number 5. Boom, there we are, blue. Interesting thing about this map is like these are big companies. This is Pacificor. Right here has Rocky Mountain Power and a lot of Wyoming. They're in red. They have big territories. Most of them are not in Wyoming. And so they have to manage all their different perspectives, and they're not necessarily Wyoming centric. This is the stuff that I was talking about when I got the blank stares of like, remember that really exciting rate hike that made the news? It was so exciting. Headlines about electricity. I was up all night. So this was cool, I thought. And what was going on? So did anybody actually even read this? Did this make anybody's radar? You guys hear about this stuff a little bit? Yeah, okay. 2 seconds of background. So what was going on? Big company said, hey, Wyoming ratepayers, they have to go, okay, one step back. These electric utilities, they are regulated monopolies, which means they get permission to operate without any competition. In exchange for, instead of all of the money they can make whenever they want it, they get a regulated rate of return. You can only make 7% per year profit, guys, no matter what you do. And the state of Wyoming will guarantee that in order to have them in our state. Okay. So every once in a while they come to the state and they say, hey, in order to make our 7% guaranteed and to meet local power demand, we need to build more transmission, or we need to build more generation, or X, Y, and Z, right? So this happened. They came in and they said, we need 20%, we need rates to be 20% higher because of X, Y, and Z. And the state basically said no. And the power company said, well, you can't really say no because you have this guaranteed rate of return. Without it, our rate of return would be 3%. And our parent company, Berkshire Hathaway, is not going to be happy with this. And so they sued. Right? Wyoming said no. So power company said we need to raise rates. Wyoming said no. And then the power company said, okay, great, we're going to sue you now because you can't do that. And then in the news, depending on what kind of news you read, you get this headline: for wind and transmission costs. Oh, that wind. It's making my power more expensive, that wind. So, okay, hold on to that. Here's this energy transition stuff really quickly. This is the giant macro trends, right? This is stuff where you're a tiny ant and you're being swept away at the currents of time. Here's what's going on in the world right now. Coal going down, natural gas going up, wind, solar going up, nuclear, sorry, flat forever, too expensive to build for a lot of reasons. Okay, but that's what's happening right now. We are in the crossroads of that in Wyoming because we have a ton of wind, we have a ton of coal. In fact, we provided most of the country with its coal since the 70s, thanks to those NOx and SOx regulations. As of now in Wyoming, we're about 20% wind, and then mostly the rest gas and coal. Gas is increasing quickly. Coal is going down quickly. Why? It's the economics again, right? This is unsubsidized, right? So no regulation. What you'll hear a lot in the news about X, Y, and Z, people playing politics. This is just the math. What's expensive and what's not. Coal is expensive to build. $100 per megawatt hour to build new coal. It's about 80 actually. Natural gas, onshore wind, bigger standard deviation there, bigger spread, but on average, cheap. And big solar photovoltaic stuff, not the stuff you have on your house, very, very cheap. So you can guess when a power company is going to build something, are they going to build something expensive or something cheap? Going to build something cheap, right? Yeah. So while this headline is not incorrect, it's just disingenuous, right? It's like Rocky Mountain Power wants a 14% rate hike because they wanted wind and transmission. If you've gone back and replaced that with coal, they probably would have needed another 20% or something, right? But anyways, you guys get it. It's just math. You build the cheap stuff, okay? And what that means for Wyoming is that a lot of our coal is going to have to find other markets besides power generation, right? If we're going to be still trying to take coal out of the ground, then we're probably not going to be burning nearly as much of it locally for power. So you ship it somewhere else, like China. The other thing, the other big macro trend, the grid is getting more complicated because of the stuff we talked about and batteries. It used to be really simple and follow that little hierarchy I showed of like generation, transmission, distribution, right? Generation, transmission, distribution. But now it looks a lot more like this like energy cloud, right? It's all mixed up together. You have power producers sending power directly to commercial customers who are doing co-generation of heat and power and sending energy back to the grid. You have interconnected transmission networks that are smart and adaptive with intelligent conductors and stuff like that. You have solar PV producers sending electricity back to the grid. You have big utility scale batteries. You have small residential scale batteries. You're trying to optimize against electric prices to save people money. It's complicated. And pretty soon you're going to have mobile batteries running around, plugging in and sending energy back to the grid to optimize their spot price and make those electric vehicles even more economic as well. In other words, it's getting complicated, okay? Energy demand. Rate of change. This is first derivative. It's been going down and down and down over time. Now, for the first time in a very long time, picking up. Anybody remember why? I mean, we talked about some of them today, but there's one other one. Data centers are the elephant in the room. So vehicle electrification is one that has the potential to once EVs are about 1% of the total vehicle population. Once that's 50%, yeah, we're gonna be up here, but it's slow. A vehicle lasts 10, 20 years. So stock turns over slowly. So it takes time. Data centers can happen really fast. They're huge. So remember, grid doesn't store power. It's expensive to move around. This is Wyoming number, $3,200 per kilowatt on peak to move it around. So a kilowatt is like, it's the maximum you can get out of an outlet like that. So if you've got a blow dryer, it's about a kilowatt. It costs $3,200 to move a kilowatt, a brand new kilowatt in Wyoming. Right? Expensive hairdryer. Here's what our distribution systems our transmission system looks like. So some of this stuff might look familiar. These are wind turbines. So this is Shirley Basin, right? Some of you guys have driven through that. Tons. This is Glen Rock Rolling Hills area. Tons. And then we've got our, friendly neighborhood power stations, this Laramie River. Bridger and the Mountain Plant, this one's being converted to natural gas, interestingly enough. And then here, here's Sheridan up there with like no generation whatsoever around it. Ours is being supplied by some gas and coal and some wind. But so these purple lines down here, biggest transmission lines in the country are about 500 kW or so. Thick conductors, big old sheets of aluminum. We don't have any of those in Wyoming. Closest ones are up in Montana. We've got some 345s, but what's the kind of interesting thing about these 345s, the big cables that we've got in Wyoming? Anybody notice a pattern?
Well, it looks like they're leaving Wyoming.
Yeah, they're leaving the state. So they're taking power generation that we generate and they're taking them all out of state. Here's the stuff that we do have. So this is the 220s. So this was the 345s added in the 220s. Those are the next biggest ones. These do the biggest work kind of between generators and consumption areas in Wyoming and some out of state too, for sure. But this is I would say our biggest backbone is 220 in Wyoming. And then this is the little stuff, the 69 kV. All of a sudden you see like, okay, there's just kind of passing through Sheridan. And all of a sudden you see like a little bit of activity. That's Buffalo. Around here, this is like the MDUs loops that they actually own. So bottom line, oh yeah, they have like the one thing about that generation, our biggest generator was like 2 gigawatts. The biggest one in the US is almost 7 gigawatts. That's a Grand Coulee Dam. So you asked about Hoover earlier, right? I think Hoover's like 4 gigawatts or so. So it's big, but Grand Coulee is much bigger. Washington. Okay, so everybody seems to be so excited. There's the grid. Remember, the grid determines how many outages we have due to like inclement weather. It determines how we handle surges in demand, like when you plug in an air conditioner or electric vehicle, anything like that. It determines how expensive your electricity is, where it comes from, all the environmental impacts. We talked a bit about that, probably not nearly enough. And it gives us as consumers opportunities to make money sometimes or save money. And all that's changing really, really quick. So the smartest of you in the room, run away. The rest of you could become forecasters like me. Any questions? Yeah.
We talked about ramping up power. And what about shedding load like they do in places where they have rolling blackouts and so on? Is that like considered a good form of management of the grid, or is
No, it's desperation. It's like walking your bike up the hill. It's like you have to get off and push. That's basically load shedding. There's a few good examples of it called demand response, where you basically say, like a good example of it would be like a chiller somewhere, some kind of process, a big industrial process. We're like, hey, we'll actually grid operator pay you to not do anything for a minute because we're in this peak right now and we're desperate. So stop doing whatever you're doing. We'll give you a lot of money. You may have heard about it in Texas when it's all market there, right? It's deregulated. So they actually had times where the price per kilowatt went up to like $3,000 or $4,000 per kilowatt. So that's your hairdryer again, right? It's like insane. And so some of these generators made all their money off the year in just one single hour of production. Right? So yeah, if you can get those big customers to shed their load during that peak, it's great. Yeah, that sometimes happens, but when it's involuntary, it's a really bad hit.
so just tell steel arc furnace users to shut it
Furnaces are a
down?
great one. Yep. Furnaces are great. Yep. Hey, thanks, Jeff.
I actually have an electric hairdryer, so I'm not using it.
It's the natural gas hair dryers. You gotta watch out for.
Okay.